Okay, good. Welcome to the 2026 Bernard Brodie Lecture on the Conditions of Peace. I'm Cal Rastiala. I direct the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations, and we have been running this lecture, the Bernard Brodie Lecture, for over 4 decades. Past speakers include President Jimmy Carter, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, former Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin. We've also had several former ambassadors, U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Mike McFaul, U.S. Ambassador to Germany, John Emerson. And last year, our speaker was the former President and Prime Minister of Armenia, Armen Sarkisian. This year, I'm really proud to welcome back to UCLA, and I'll get to that in a second, someone who's been here many times before. I think he is the rare and possibly the unique Brodie lecturer to actually be a native Angelino, possibly our first. Eric Garcetti served as the mayor of Los Angeles and most recently as U.S. Ambassador to India. I'm going to give him a full introduction in a moment, but first I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how the rest of the afternoon will unfold. So once I introduce Ambassador Garcetti, he's going to come up here, give some remarks, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, something like that. He and I will then sit in those 2 chairs. We'll have a brief conversation about a host of topics. Well, I have no idea exactly what he's going to say. His title was cryptic and encompassing. So I'm open for all sorts of things. We'll then open up to questions from all of you. We do have handheld microphones, so please wait to be called on. Obviously raise your hand. I will call on you. When you get the microphone, most importantly, please keep your questions short and to the point. There is only one Brodie lecturer today, and it's Eric Garcetti. So let me introduce our speaker. Eric Michael Garcetti currently serves as Ambassador for Global Climate Diplomacy for C40 cities, where he advances climate cooperation among the world's major cities, states, and regions. From 2023 to 2025, he served as the American Ambassador to India, leading one of our nation's largest diplomatic missions, building closer ties between the world's 2 largest democracies, and most famously, dancing the Taba Taba. Garcetti previously served 12 years on the LA City Council. Just look that video up if you don't know what I'm talking about. Garcetti previously served 12 years on the LA City Council before being elected in 2013 as the youngest mayor in the history of the city of LA, and was reelected in 2017 by a record margin. In 2019, he joined as chair of the C40 Cities, a coalition of 100 of the world's leading cities committed to climate action. In addition, he serves on the board of the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Global Diplomacy Council of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. For many years, he taught international relations at Occidental College right here in LA. He's a former US Navy intelligence officer. He holds a BA and an MA from Columbia University, studied as a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford and at LSE. Most importantly, Ambassador Garcetti is a graduate of UCLA, of the UCLA Elementary School, where I have it on good authority, he was the undisputed tetherball champion of 3rd grade. Please join me in welcoming to UCLA, Eric Garcetti.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Cal, and what a joy it is to come back to where my academic career started as a 4-year-old. I can only remember the tetherball hitting me in the face, so I think the championship is too generous. And it's wonderful to see so many of you, friends that I've known throughout my life, folks that I've worked with and who have been along my side at City Hall, mentors like Xavier Oslovsky, who's here in the front row. And I really want to thank the center for inviting me. I think I want to thank them, because 6 months ago when they said, you want to give this speech, I said, sure, I'm sure, things are changing in the world, but what can happen in 6 months? And literally, as I speak, is when the deadline, I know it's been extended, but the deadline of the ceasefire was to occur. I bet no other Brodie lecturer has given a real-time conditions of peace speech. So I thought we'd just do it together, and you can kind of pull your right earlobe if we're at war, or left if the peace is holding, to just give me a hint. But let me jump in and give some thank yous later. In the forests of Kibale National Park in Uganda, scientists, some of you might have read about this recently, have spent 30 years watching a community of chimpanzees, 200 of them, moving through the forest in small bands, grooming each other, hunting together, acting as one family. But then, a little bit over a decade ago, in June of 2015, something changed. and two bands met on a hillside, and as one researcher put it, quote, all hell broke loose. What followed was not a momentary flare of aggression, but the beginning of a war, the bloodiest ever recorded among chimpanzees in history. 28 deaths, a majority of them children, over a decade of active warfare. And two subcommunities that had been part of a single family turned on each other with a ferocity that surprised the scientists watching them. What caused it? Well, 5 adult males died the year before, probably from disease. And these weren't just any 5 individuals. They were the social bridges, chimpanzees whose relationships spanned different clusters within the group, and who collectively held the community together through accumulated bonds of trust. And when they died, those bridges also crumbled. Low-level tensions that had always existed had nothing to hold them in check. All of a sudden, said one researcher, yesterday's friend became today's foe. You know, one of the scientists offered a reflection on what the research means, that caring for social bonds can counter violence. If that's the case, 6 million years ago, we split off from our closest ancestors, but still hold 99% of the same DNA. And if that case holds, the conflict management in our own lives becomes a local responsibility, a civic duty, if we are to bring about a more peaceful world. A local and civic duty. That phrase is at the heart of what I want to share with you today. And it's funny you talked about the cryptic title. When you're saying yes to something, you offer a title long before you know what you're going to say, but I think it'll come back around. You know, Bernard Brodie, I don't know if many of you know, but I brought his book actually here today. He was one of the great intellects of our world, and certainly at UCLA. This is a tough book to get. I bought one paperback version of this, then in downtown LA, had my car broken into on the way to the airport, and it was stolen. Everything else was covered by insurance, but I'm like, I can't get this book again. It took me another month just to find one. But War and Politics and the other books he wrote really were seminal works in the post-war era about talking about peace. And he spent his career asking a question that sounds simple, but it is not. What makes peace possible? Not peace as the absence of war, as others had written, but peace as a condition, a set of arrangements, habits, institutions, and calculations that make catastrophic conflict less likely and human flourishing more possible. He understood that peace is not natural. It's constructed, and like all constructed things, it requires maintenance, adaptation, and when the structure begins to fail, the courage to rebuild rather than simply mourn. Brodie also understood that military power divorced from coherent political purpose, sound familiar? Produces what he called strategic absurdity. You win the battle, but you lose the war. You achieve your tactical objective, but generate a catastrophe more dangerous than the problem you set out to solve. Today before you, I come to Brodie's question from 3 vantage points. First, as a scholar of international relations. Second, as a council member and mayor for over 21 and a half years, who built international architecture from city halls on climate, migration, resilience, gender equity, and more. And third, from my experience as your ambassador to India from 2023 to 2025. And from each and all of these perspectives, I've witnessed how the conditions of peace are under stress in ways that are structural, not merely political. It will not be restored by any single election or any return to a previous normal. They must be rebuilt, not just by leaders, but all of us. Rebuilt more honestly, rebuilt more inclusively, and rebuilt more durably than before. Imagine for a moment that the international order that all of us in this room have lived in our lifetimes, no matter what your age, is a building. Since 1945, we've all been living in the most stable building in terms of an international order in human history, well, certainly modern history. A building that was constructed atop the ashes of World War II by people determined not to repeat the catastrophe that killed 70 million human beings. They built the United Nations, Bretton Woods, NATO, a nuclear non-proliferation regime, the international trading system, and great power war, which had defined the previous century, did not recur. Global poverty fell more dramatically than at any point in human history. Now, the building wasn't paradise, but it was, in Brodie's terms, a set of conditions that made catastrophic conflict less likely and human flourishing more possible. This building, though, I would offer, is a historic anomaly, not just in its durability, but in its singularity. For most of human history, international order has come in overlapping, competing partial structures. The Roman order coexisted with the Parthian, the Han, the Gupta. Most generations of human beings have seen buildings of international order rise and fall in their lifetimes. But for nearly 3 generations, ours has stood. And sure, we've had to replace the pipes from time to time. We'd like to redecorate the interior, and even been challenged sometimes from within the building by competing ideologies, such as during the Cold War, or from a global South who felt confined to the basement in this building. But even at the most contested moments during the East-West standoffs or North-South decolonization, during the proxy war era, the building held a shared logic and stood strong. The UN Security Council still convened, arms control negotiations still proceeded, the laws of war still nominally applied. Rivals and resistors operated from within the building. They didn't build a separate one. And what was also unusual about the post-World War II era was that a critical mass of the most economically powerful, militarily capable, disproportionately liberal nations provided sufficient weight to make this building stand. If you wanted to find the architect of that building, it wasn't post-1945. It probably started with Immanuel Kant, who argued in 1795 in the Perpetual Peace that peace would be constructed by 3 interlocking mechanisms. First, republican governance, where citizens who bear the cost of war are much less likely to choose it. Second, international law and institutions, providing mechanisms to resolve conflicts short of violence. And then third, commerce and exchange, generating a mutual dependency and therefore mutual restraint. In the place of Kantian restraint and dependency, we now have a new age that I call the age of rage. Rage is all the rage these days, you see. The most powerful political mobilizer, the most profitable deliverer of information, the most significant social force within and between nations. But the age of rage is much more than an emotion. It is a felt experience of all 3 of those Kantian legs cracking simultaneously. And that simultaneity is what makes this moment genuinely different, at least in our lifetimes. First, the Republican leg cracking through disinformation, feeding parasitically off social media algorithms, and severing the connection between shared reality and democratic deliberation. Income inequality has broken the accountability loop between those who decide on war and those who bleed in it. Impatient electorates and the death of bipartisan and coalition politics have made the long-term compromise-dependent governance of Kant's republicanism that it requires nearly impossible. Second, the international law leg is cracking. Not only is existing law being flouted, Russia's territorial conquest, the paralysis of the WTO, and so many more examples, but the very pipeline of new law, the process by which nations negotiate new constraints for new challenges, from AI to climate, is slowed to near paralysis. We face 21st century problems with aging 20th century legal architecture. And third, the trade as peace leg is cracking in ways that may be cut deepest. We see the nationalization of trade around the world, but significantly here in the US, in 3 different administrations, 2 different presidents, and 2 different parties, both of those parties have arrived at a place where the Kantian wager on commerce as a constraint on conflict no longer holds and is being abandoned. And when the largest economy in the world reaches that conclusion, it matters enormously. Now, as I said before, this building had structural problems its managers preferred not to discuss. The foundation was never universal. It encoded power asymmetries of 1945. It deferred maintenance across every major institution. And here, the Ugandan forest returns. Social bridges quietly have disappeared. The people who actually lived through the greatest generation are physically increasingly not here, but the memories as well. And the social conditioning of those times are gone. So when Donald Trump, channeling some of the rage felt by global citizens today, walked by this building that we have called the International Order's home, and threw a Molotov cocktail into the window of that building, he ignited a fire that we are witnessing today, erecting tariffs, ignoring treaties, defunding institutions, and abandoning alliances. The most powerful country in the world suddenly seems to be destroying everything that we built over so many years. Now, so many of us, the institutionalists, the practitioners inside that building, are looking at that fire and acting like firefighters and tenants, understandably rushing to put out the fire that was filled with hope and nostalgia to restore for what once was. But this building in which we have lived for so long, that has kept the peace, we somehow naively imagine it will rise again if merely we can extinguish the flames, get to another election, and replace leadership. But here's the hard truth. If that political pyromaniac had never come along, the building was crumbling at its very foundations already. So it is time for us, and my call to arms today is to stop acting like tenants and firefighters, and to start thinking like engineers and architects, and imagine what comes next, because the moment demands that of us. In this rapidly changing world, if we are to be the authors of peace, it's time to think about that post-moment architecture. Brodie deserves to be tested, though, in reality, not just honored in theory. Over the past 52 days, we have seen in real time what happens when Brodie's warning is ignored. We've been told that the United States went to war, among other explanations, against Iran to prevent it from ever having a nuclear weapon. The military operation that ensued was, by conventional measures, quite successful. An air force destroyed, 90% of Iran's navy was destroyed, nuclear facilities were struck, missiles were destroyed. But in achieving that tactical success, we revealed something that neither Washington nor Tehran had fully understood. Iran already possessed a weapon of mass destruction. It had always possessed it. It simply hadn't known until we attacked how easy it would be to use. The Strait of Hormuz. More than 20% of global seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas flows through that choke point. And Iran, even with its navy largely destroyed, can threaten passing ships with mines, missiles, and cheap drones, creating such pervasive insecurity that global marine insurance markets stop providing coverage. The strait closed without Iran firing a single decisive shot. We set out to prevent Iran from having a weapon of mass destruction and revealed that it already had one. And this is just one living example of how the world is changing. Consider these three examples together. First, Iran, of course, discovering its weapon didn't need to be a nuclear bomb, just control of the right choke point. Ukraine, discovering that a country with effectively no navy can defeat the world's third largest navy using cheap naval drones that sank or disabled more than a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet and forced its retreat. Warships costing hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars, hunted by drones costing a few $100,000, bringing about, as one analyst said, a new era in naval warfare, the era of the timid navy. And China, thirdly, is learning that chip bans from our country, intention to protect us, may inspire the very domestic capability that they were meant to prevent. That weaponized interdependence, when overused, just teaches the target how to escape the choke point. These are not arguments, to be clear, against integration. That's in my title, right? They are arguments for thinking more carefully about what kind of integration actually produces peace rather than leverage. And the Kantian wager, I'm not going to give up on. I don't think it's wrong. It's merely incomplete today. Interdependence works as a peace mechanism when it is roughly symmetric and when legitimate institutions exist to resolve disputes short of war and weaponization. But when it is asymmetric, and when those institutions themselves are weakened, as we are witnessing, or even absent, the Kantian handshake becomes a chokehold, and nations are learning to avoid it. But here is where the failure of the conditions of peace actually look like, not in a Security Council resolution or not in a diplomatic cable. Let me bring this down to the human level. I spent the most incredible 2.5 years living in India. I dreamed of going there since my parents took me there as a 14-year-old and having the chance to live there. Then representing this country in what's now the second largest mission we have after our mission in Mexico in the world, I saw this incredible country. But in this moment, It is the world's second largest importer of liquefied petroleum gas, 60% of which comes through the Strait of Hormuz. When that strait closed, the gas stopped flowing, and in kitchens across India, the blue flame flickered. This is not a minor convenience for Indians. Prime Minister Modi's signature domestic achievement was a program to bring gas connections to over 330 million Indian households. That's 1.4 billion people. Families who had previously cooked over wood, scrap, or cow dung. And when that flame flickered recently, people lined up for hours to buy cylinders. A restaurant in Bengaluru, opened since 1943, took fried items off of its menu because its kitchen had 2 days of gas. They didn't know if they could pay the people who worked there. Crematories struggled to operate. Hospital kitchens faced cuts. A country of 1.4 billion people on the cusp of becoming the third largest economy reduced to asking, do we have any gas today? This is what strategic absurdity looks like when it lands on ordinary human beings living in local communities. So, where do we go from here? The future international landscape will probably not produce, I would offer, a single building to replace the one we've been living in. It will demand that we construct multiple buildings, overlapping, partial, variously membered structures that together produce enough of the conditions of peace to prevent catastrophe. This is not some sort of counsel of despair. I know it's nice to live in a single building and to think that you're going to pass it on to your children and your children's children. But remember, this is how international order and most of our ancestors have always lived. What was anomalous, that singularity of the post-World War II system, that was a one-time thing. The plurality that preceded it and that will most likely succeed it is back to normal. Previous generations knew how to do this because they had lived through it. They had lived through order collapse. Think about the architects right after World War II. They had seen Versailles fail, a League of Nations collapse, a decade of depression, and half a decade of total war. We have spent our entire adult lives inside a single, unusually stable structure. So we have no literacy. We have no muscle memory. We are, in a genuine sense, institutionally naive about what building international order from rubble actually requires, which means we have to become students of order construction faster than any previous generation has had to. Let me offer you 3 ways to guide that work today as the collective peace builders of tomorrow. The good news is that the new architecture is not theoretical, and some of this is already moving, already being built. Economist Richard Baldwin, in a book that came out this month, describes what is emerging from the wreckage of the US-centered trading order as a multi-hub solar system. He also used a metaphor of a building. He called it the cathedral of the trade order that's coming down. But this multi-hub solar system, which are regional trade blocks, expanding and linking each other through domino regionalism, are driven not by design by the invisible hand of powerful nations, but they are instead diversifying away from dependency on the United States and China. Think about recent agreements like EU-Mercosur, EU-India, CPTPP expansion, African Union frameworks deepening. None of this was top-down designed. It was bottom-up. At the strategic level, secondly, another framework I'd like to introduce to you that I witnessed as ambassador to India, and I'll just take the US-India example. Organizations and structures like the Quad, which is the US, India, Japan, and Australia, the work that we do together, talking about everything from disaster relief to climate to space, together with things like the IMEC, India, Middle East, European Corridor, which seeks not to put just the old Silk Route back, but the spice route back, and link South Asia, Arabia, and Europe together. In essence, bringing that Kantian promise of economic dependency back. These are what I will call neither multilateral nor unilateral, but interlateral structures. Purpose-built coalitions of the specifically interested, constructing frameworks for specific challenges. Think about AUKUS in terms of security with the United States, Australia. I didn't know the Australian Consul General would be here, but there's a lot of Australia content. Or even BRICS, which is falling short but has that same aspiration. Not bilateral deals, not universal institutions, but something in between, overlapping, almost like Lego pieces that can come together and be taken apart, legitimately plural. And an example that brings us to the third point, kind of blends both of these together. Subnational climate action, which is my work as mayor and now my job today. Cities making binding commitments to each other that their own national governments wouldn't make, has surpassed in ambition and measurable results the climate action of all but a handful of nations. In Glasgow, at COP26, I represented the cities of the world, initially 100, the biggest cities that were about a quarter of the world's GDP. But we expanded to 1,000, the equivalent of a country bigger than every country but 4. And we were the only folks invited to the stage alongside the presidents and prime ministers to make the pledge and hold ourselves accountable to being carbon neutral. So far, one country on this planet is on the path to meet the requirements of the Paris Climate Accords. One, Denmark. But of the 100 largest cities of the world, 75% of them, including Los Angeles, are on track or ahead of track. And don't tell me cities aren't tough to run. Our economy here is as big as the 9th largest economy in the world. It is the 3rd largest city economy at more than $2 trillion in the Southern California region. So this network of governments voluntarily building the architecture of obligation from below is an important ingredient, not only challenging the bellicose environment we have today, but meeting the great challenges that our people are experiencing with climate change. The local dimension of the conditions of peace goes deeper than just climate policy. Eleanor Roosevelt, many of you I'm sure are familiar with a quote when she talked about when she was asked where do human rights actually begin, her answer was in small places close to home. So small and so close that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. The places where we study, the places where we live, the places where we work and pray, that human rights mean nothing globally if they don't mean something there. And the same is true with the conditions of peace. The forces pulling the international order apart didn't originate in foreign ministries. This is maybe the most important point I want to make today. They originated in communities that lost manufacturing jobs to the China shock, that were told that this was progress, in towns where the opioid crisis arrived the same year the factory closed, in the ballot box where people left behind found their vocabulary in nativist politics and grievance. Let me say that when the grand strategy tends to obscure, that most things actually start in local communities. This post-World War II building distributed its benefits disproportionately to the powerful. The global South was in the basement. Rural communities in the American West were given efficiency and handed closures. In an Indian state like Jharkhand, they were promised all sorts of things, but only got resource extraction. The age of rage is the accumulated invoice of that exclusion. And any new architecture that repeats that mistake will face the same revolt. So our new architecture must invest significantly more at the subnational level. Of course, you're going to get that prejudice from a former mayor, but it's true. In community resilience, in alleviating material suffering, in addressing the domestic conditions of political fraying that make people more willing to elect bellicose leaders. Local leaders are not merely implementers of agreements handed down from above. They are the first line of offense and of defense. Take Allies, the Alliance for Local Leaders International, recently launched by Ambassador Nina Hachigian, who served as your deputy mayor in my administration for international relations. We started this by talking to mayors in Eastern Central Europe who were resisting people like Viktor Orban. And as we saw troops and ICE agents come to towns like Minneapolis, we wanted to know what is the playbook to resist. And now we're writing that playbook, connecting local leaders globally across borders to share playbooks for defending democracy itself, how to respond when disinformation targets your community, how to engage with Beijing when it reaches out to your city, how to communicate with a foreign policy crisis suddenly lands in your city. The conditions of peace are made or unmade in rural Jharkhand, in rural West Virginia, right here in the neighborhoods of Los Angeles, and that is where our work must begin. The term I'll give this third framework is civic substrate, the underlying layer of communities, cities, and local institutions that ties people and places together below the level of nation states. In construction, of course, substrate is what you prepare before you pour the foundation. Not the visible structure, but what makes the structure possible, what determines whether what is built above it will hold or not. And unlike the structures above it, it is largely invisible, which is why it's so often understandably neglected. why its failure goes unnoticed until the building above it begins to crack. The threat to the civic substrate is not the fire from above, the arsonists, the autocrats. It is neglect and rot from below, economic despair, civic disengagement, epistemic collapse that disinformation produces in communities with no shared reality. It's our darn social media feed. It is the preparation of the ground on which everything else must be ordered. The post-World War II order failed to reach the basement, but the civic substrate is our commitment not to repeat that failure and to build this time from the bottom up. So, where is the United States in all of this? I felt viscerally, in 2 years as your ambassador, what American power feels like, what it means when exercised with generosity and confidence. We were the key architects of this post-World War II order. We designed its foundation, we funded its construction, we enforced its rules, imperfectly, even sometimes hypocritically, but with enough consistency to make this building stand for 80 years. And even as we, the architects, are burning the building down, the world can't afford to have the United States absent from future design. No one country can now be the master architect. China has the ambition, but not yet the relationships. Europe has the values, but not the strategic weight. India has the scale and democratic legitimacy, but not yet the global capacity. And its strategic autonomy doctrine deliberately precludes that role for now. Middle powers are building what Prime Minister Mark Carney has described as a third path with energy and seriousness. But they need a major power at the table, the major power at the table, if what they build is to have the weight to hold. The world needs the United States not as a unilateral enforcer, but as a humble and indispensable architect. And not the United States as a single leader, but all of us, the institutions, the immigrants, the subnational entities that we have that collectively can model once again what it means when the world is reflected on the streets of our cities and our states, and what that means to the world when we radiate it out. Let me name those obligations directly as I close. I think we can't talk about Brodie without first and foremost, as we look at the threats to peace, hold the nuclear floor. We forget that was part of the excuse of this war in Iran, but absolutely non-negotiably, regardless of who is in power in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, and too many other places, the doomsday clock stands at 85 seconds to midnight, the most perilous setting in its 79-year history. And Brodie's foundational contribution was that the purpose of military power is no longer to win wars, but to avert them. That must not become a negotiating chip between buildings. Second, govern our shared challenges now, from wherever we stand. Climate, AI, pandemics, and migration, they're not going to wait for a political moment to improve. The Strait of Hormuz crisis that we are experiencing today as I speak is also an argument for accelerating an energy transition, not as idealism, but as a strategic necessity. Every percentage point of the global economy that moves off fossil fuels, still 80% of what fuels our world economy, reduces the leverage of these choke points through which these fuels travel. That's not environmentalism, that's Brodie. Third, rebuild shared stakes across all of the buildings, including the voices that were excluded the last time. The Global South is not wrong to feel that the rules were written without them. Listen to Africa. Don't treat it as just a place where there's supposed to be assistance or development, but see it as the powerhouse that it is becoming. Look in the Global South for the intellectual capital and ideas that are flowing from there, and treat them as equals, not as lessers. And fourth, and this brings us back to where I started, tend the bridges relentlessly. We might not be chimpanzees, but we have diplomats, alliances, those fora and people-to-people connections that make all the difference. I learned that as mayor. I learned that as ambassador, that usually those big moments of history come down to a relationship that two or a handful of people have with each other, that they didn't just show up at the moment of crisis, but that they know each other and trust each other and can navigate the toughest moments. It is in the precise sense that the primatologist meant our civic duty. This is the Ngogo lesson. International relations isn't just conducted in South Block, for those of you who know India, or in the Oval Office. It's conducted in places that I've witnessed, like a cricket pitch in South India, where blind bowlers and batters remind me that a human connection doesn't even require sight. It was at a girls' school that I saw in Rajasthan, where students who had never met an American, let alone an American ambassador, had their ambitions permanently altered by a single conversation. In the farmers whose mangoes crossed an ocean before they shared their sweetness with friends on another continent. It is a kitchen, that kitchen in Bengaluru, where a tiny blue flame, an ordinary, tiny, civilizational flame, tells a family that the world is, for this moment, still working. And it is in a forest in Uganda, where scientists are learning that the capacity for lethal conflict and the capacity for peace-sustaining bonds are not opposites. Like it or not, they are the same inheritance, pulling in different directions. The direction we move depends on this room and rooms like this, which bonds we tend, which bridges we let fall. The building is on fire, my friends. Some of what is burning needed to come down, the rot, the injustice, the deferred maintenance of decades. Let it go. But the conditions of peace, the habits of restraint, the channels of communication, the shared stakes, the absolute refusal to let catastrophic conflict become thinkable again, these must survive the fire. These must be the load-bearing walls we take to the new structures. And we will construct more than one, and we will construct and adapt and construct again as every generation before ours has had to. Bernard Brodie spent his life arguing that the purpose of military power was not to win a war, but to avert them, and that the highest function of strategy was not victory, but the construction of conditions which made catastrophic defeat for anyone become impossible. Today, we are his inheritors, and this age of rage will pass. Rage always does. I used to say a prayer when I was mayor every night before I went to sleep. I used to ask God to bring peace to this world. And as I closed my eyes, I then asked him to bring peace to this country and peace to our state, the golden state of California. And then I would bring it back to our city, bring peace to the city of angels. And I'd think about my neighborhood and ask him to bring peace to that neighborhood and the people who were my neighbors, and then to my household and my family. And I'd always end with, and please bring peace to me. If we don't start from the smallest unit, we can't hope for there to be world peace. But the time has come for all of us to understand that the conditions of peace aren't over there. They're right here tonight. Thank you.
Let me just start. You focused on the war, and at the end you talked a lot about your experiences in India, here, those connections.
And so let me just ask you about where you see India specifically in relation to this conflict. So you mentioned the energy connection, you mentioned their strategic autonomy, such an important place that you know so well. What do you see happening in the next months, weeks, years, whatever time frame you want to pick?
It's a great question. I think I'll be in India next week, so I wish this was a question in 2 weeks because it would be more informed from conversations I'll have. But India has really, post-war India and independent India was really defined by three things, all of which are kind of gone. But one of them, which was the non-aligned sense, has been replaced by this thing called strategic autonomy. India, I always joke, loves being the prettiest guy or prettiest girl at the dance. Russia dances with us, America dances with us. Besides Pakistan and China, they can talk to anybody, and they like that. And they don't want to be tied down. If alliances are the marriages of international relations, they want to date, and they're not interested in getting married. As a side note, if I can embarrass my former executive officer, who's a PhD student here, Poonam Narwat, she got married yesterday in the Bay Area. Congratulations, Poonam. She's right there. That aside, but I think the last year has been really tough on India. When I saw Prime Minister Modi when I left, he was really grateful. I think no American president has known India and been as pro-India as President Biden was. But he was confident in his relationship with Donald Trump. And I was very polite about it, but I kind of said in nicer words, be surprised, he might try to screw you 3 ways you don't see coming. And I've counted 5 already. And this way that they kind of figured that their very close personal relationship would disrupt stuff. I joke with my Indian friends, Indians, as that we've been negotiating a trade deal, finally met their match because Donald Trump negotiates like an Indian. I think Indians will know that, where it's like, okay, now one more thing. And they're like thrown off their game. Second, Pakistan played Trump so well that they're at the center of all of this. And I think that's extremely frustrating to the Indians diplomatically, who are very good diplomats and very skilled. And third, India is so closely tied most of our military maps, which is where we see most of the world, like we have a line in our military commands between India and Pakistan. So everything to the west is Pakistan and the Middle East, that's Central Command. And Indo-Pacific Command is everything to the east. That, I used to joke, India is usually where the legend is. It's at the fringes. Instead of centering a map in which you put South Asia in the middle. And you understand just how close historically and today South Asia and the Arab and Middle Eastern areas, they call it West Asia, because that's their perspective, of course, not the Middle East, it's west of them, those countries wouldn't function without Indian workers. India wouldn't function without the capital that comes back, but increasingly it's entrepreneurs from India who are working in places like UAE, and I know we have a representative from the UAE consulate here, and there's this wonderful relationship. The Middle East wouldn't eat without India, and India wouldn't thrive without the Middle East. And I think that they are very, very worried about what's happening. And the last thing I'll say is, I think for everybody, just like us as Americans, those of us who are Americans here, Donald Trump's inconsistency is only consistent in that it's inconsistent always. And that's tough to, when you are responsible for making sure the blue flame keeps flickering, and there's material things, not just strategic ones, to know how to plan. And I think India, like many others, are just trying to get through the moment.
Great. So you mentioned Pakistan and the way Pakistan is so central. You also talked a lot, and you went pretty deep about the way the international system has worked, the way it was set up since 1945. I'm just going to stick to India for a little bit longer, and then we're going to talk more about local issues. But with India, it's interesting. India was one of the original signatories of the UN Charter, even before it was independent. But it's also been one of the most unhappy states about the current order that you mentioned, the way that, for example, the Security Council ratifies this sort of power structure of 1945. India would like to be represented. They're not happy with a lot of other features. Part of their autonomy, I think, stems from this sense of they don't really want to fit into either camp as they see it. So where do you see them going in the metaphor that you used? What sort of construction project would they take on if they could?
It's a great question because, I think India is experiencing, and India did, I was very blessed that my first year, they were hosting G20. So it was the hottest country in the world. We had the most visits for my Secretary of Treasury of any country in the world was India 4 times. It was like every week I was getting Secretary of State, head of the CIA, National Security Advisor, the president then came for G20. And India did a marvelous job of also inviting in the African Union to the table and doing a pre-meeting with groups that weren't, with countries that weren't big enough to be in the G20 to really do that Indian thing of saying, hey, we are the translators. India really sees itself as the crossroads of north-south, of east-west, of kind of big and small. And it does quite a good job with that. But I think India is now going out from being kind of domestically and regionally focused to increasingly looking in the world. For instance, when we had the Houthi kind of attacks on ships in the Red Sea, we put together a coalition. They didn't want to formally be part of the coalition, but the first time they put a dozen ships in the Western Indian Ocean, and when there was hijackings of Somali pirates, they actually boarded those ships and freed people in the way that the US has done in the past. And they didn't just do that because there was Indian sailors, they did it as part of the global commons and the freedom of navigation. If you want to be an architect, the problem is once you're an architect, you got to actually maintain the building. And I think that's what India's wondering about, how much do we want to put into the system? Because then that requires us to actually maintain it as well. And they have historically preferred to focus on their own nation building and a little bit in the region. I do see in India, though, prouder and more confident to emerge into that space, to be more involved in international organizations and even locating international organizations in India. The International Solar Alliance, I'm going to mess up the acronym, the Coalition for Resilient Development, but basically Climate Disaster International Organization is there, CRDC. And so they, I think, are envisioning themselves now as a place the world comes to, even bidding for the Olympics, for 2036, I think. So those are all newly cosmopolitan international, whether they want to be architects or not. I think they should be. I would absolutely welcome it. They're indispensable. And one magic thing I'll say, the US and India together, talk about the bilateral relationship. I always said it wasn't an additive relationship of the US plus India, it was multiplicative. And when the US and India did things, for instance, we started this trilateral development initiative, where India and the U.S., India didn't want development aid from the U.S., still a poor country per capita, but proud, and they said we can do things on our own. But they said, we have experts, and you have money, and you have experts. Let's go to third countries like Fiji, Tanzania, and start being two great powers together working on stuff. And that's some of that, new level that I was talking about in my speech, the interlateral.
Great. So when you were mayor, you referenced this obliquely. You mentioned Nina Hachigian, who we both know, who was your first mayor, deputy mayor.
First in American history in any city.
Right, for international affairs. So that was a path-breaking thing. There's now that tradition has continued in Los Angeles. There's still a position like that. What motivated you to do that? And you talked a bit, I think you referenced in your speech, some of the things that probably brought that to being. But tell me how you thought about that and what made you think that cities needed to engage in a serious way.
The personal explanation is how I was raised. My parents grew up on opposite sides of the city. My mom from the west side, central, and then west side. My dad from South LA, a Jew, Mexican, who met at Pan Am Airlines. And my dad had never left the country. They got engaged 3 weeks after their first date, got married 3 weeks later, and headed off to London. And if they ever had extra money, my mom stayed at Pan Am, they would spend it on us seeing the world. Not vacations, but trips to places like India when I was 14, or China just after it opened up. And that planted a seed in me that I think all of us as Angelenos know, that we can see the face of the world on the streets of LA. But the opposite was true, that I felt like I saw the face of LA on the streets of the world. I could be at home in Mexico City or Cairo or Tokyo because I grew up here. So that was, I think, the personal answer. The political answer or policy answer is, I knew that we have the largest port in the Western Hemisphere. At one point when I was mayor, the third busiest airport and the number one busiest airport of origination and destination, where flights start and stop in the world. Look at our population, 63% of us immigrants are children of immigrants, not counting migrants from inside the US who go from one state to another. So you cannot succeed as a city if you don't. But then we also were woefully behind. Sure, we exported movies, but only 1% of our businesses do any international business in this town. So we sought to double that. And as I looked at the things we were doing, climate work, we could be very successful in LA, but if the whole world wasn't doing it, we'd all suffer. We needed to build an office and a position that wasn't just about protocol. We have more consulates here than all but 2 cities in the world. And very proud that India has opened up its new consulate here. San Francisco is a great city, but it's not LA. And we're waiting for Vietnam to fully make that. But every other country basically in the world has, bigger country has a consulate here. And so in the past it was just protocol, like who's visiting and do that. But if we were going to win the Olympics, if we were going to expand international trade, create jobs, et cetera, we need to do that. Third is in an emergency, it's really good. It strengthens your city. When I was chair of C40, which again is the 100 largest cities in the world, it's the only mayor organization about anything. It happens to be around climate. But when the pandemic hit, second Zoom I ever did, I still didn't know what a Zoom really was. I called all those, it's actually 97 mayors, and if you can imagine all the different time zones, somebody was in the middle of the morning and the night. We got, I think, 50 of them, which was remarkable. I think the first time 50 mayors of, it was Tokyo and Melbourne and London and Mexico City, we all got on a call together. And the mayor, now late mayor of Seoul, told us about how you could do testing in a car, drive-through testing, but long before anybody knew what that was. The mayor of Milan, because remember that first week, that was the hot spot in the world, said this is what you need to do with your hospital so that fewer people die. Literally what you need to do with the beds. And immediately mayors, who I always joke, good mayors borrow, great mayors steal, were thieves stealing these ideas and implementing them. And my successor at C40, who's still our chair, the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, told the story of going to Boris Johnson and sharing this Zoom call. And Boris Johnson was getting upset and talking to his cabinet, why aren't we doing these things? Getting masks cheaper, figuring out ways to get our hospitals. They're like, sir, we're putting the report together, it'll be ready this week or next, and then you can start talking to other prime ministers and presidents. And Sadiq said, the difference between mayors and cities and that local level and us being networked internationally was hours and days versus weeks and months. And here in those early days, Los Angeles had a death rate that was half of New York's. New York was a little further ahead with the infection, but they also waited longer to shut down, and it was part of the reason I shut the city down first. And we don't want to talk about the pandemic, it never happened, I know we all got through it. but those international connections are there when you need them in emergencies.
One of the things I like to point out to students is that LA County, at 10 million population roughly, would be a median-sized country in the world. So if you look at the kind of median country, there's about 200 countries, median size is about 9 or 10 million. So we're a pretty big place on its own terms. You're talking about the linkages and how these linkages can kind of amplify that, which is really important. Where do you see that going? So you established this kind of system, or I don't know who set up C40, but you were integral to it. It's continued on. We know that at the state level, there's also state-to-state interactions, meaning state of California, these kind of interactions. If you want to look ahead 5 years, 10 years, do you think that's going to continue? Do you think it's going to grow? Where do you see it happening?
Absolutely. I mean, I came back from Montreal, or Montreal, as they say there in French, and it was their climate week last week, and they asked me and Gina McCarthy, who used to be our EPA head and now is head of America's All In, which is after being the climate, the nation's first national climate advisor under President Biden. We were like, we still like you as Canadians, and we're still doing climate stuff. We wanted to just let them know. Because if you read the headlines, you think that everything's turning to hell in the world, when in reality, these moments are actually seeing the work expand and grow, not the opposite. I was asked by UCLA students, some of whom may be here today for the International Relations Journal here, well, can't the federal government like stop our climate progress? It's just one type of fake news, that's just fake news. Yes, there are important things like whether the EPA can regulate greenhouse gases that I don't want to downplay. But 80 to 90% of the action has always been and always will be subnational. It's your taxes, it's your bills paying the Department of Water and Power. Federal government can't tell us what energy mix, and don't really want to tell us what energy mix we're going to have. And so we'll go from 3% when I started as a council member in 2001 to 97% zero carbon electricity in those 3 decades. You can see when I was down in Brazil representing the cities of the world, the second largest contingent, by the way, of local and state officials after Brazil itself was the United States. And all these people are like, what? The US is still doing this stuff? I said, not only are we like bluish people doing it, in Texas, did you guys know that in Texas, Florida, and Ohio were responsible for 70% of the renewable power in this country last year? And that the largest oil basin in America, the Permian Basin in Texas, that the really red leaders of Texas are decarbonizing it at a rate now more quickly than California. I mean, we've already done it, but at a rate now that's the fastest in the country. So, you can hear the propaganda, but I think that was just climate. These networks will continue to expand. Technology makes it easy. I think we're finding that sweet spot of working at the subnational level, and we hope we get national governments that work with us. And when they do, you can go even further, but nothing's holding us back.
Last question from me, and then we'll open it up. So just riffing on that, climate, your longstanding interest in that, you mentioned in your remarks about the war and the impact it's had on India, but also here. We see gas prices are high all over the world, LNG, all of these issues. Do you see this conflict as somehow turning into a turning point for thinking about the strategic elements of climate change? Not only climate change as an environmental issue, which has sort of dropped off of our media attention, but the fact that fossil fuels are so vulnerable in all the ways that you described. How do you see that evolving?
Well, I wish I could give an easy answer, but the complicated answer is I think a lot of people are seeing the way the world economy is constructed now. You're either overly dependent on petrostates, or you're going to be overly dependent on renewable manufacturing states. That we will displace the leverage that certain countries have now with the potential leverage of mostly China. And China's done an amazing job being able to produce cheap electricity for the world and renewable power inputs. But we need to figure out a way to diversify from both. So
let me just push on that for a second. Once you buy the solar panels, which are incredibly cheap from China, just to go with solar for a second, then you have them, and the energy's all essentially manufactured at home. Isn't that fundamentally different?
Yes, it absolutely could be, but when you have a 20% jump in the power that's needed because of data centers and the growth of AI, which people don't like, but also when polled, they like that America's leading, but they don't like it at all, and then they like using it. It's like this.
Our students love it.
Yeah, I'm sure, exactly. And we can find you, and we know when you're using it.
I wish.
But that sense of Like I was reading a great piece, actually written by an Australian who was talking about that supply chain, like where, you know, the competition between AI, war if we can't find peace, and power is going to be this three-way fight where countries are putting strategic plans of how to take those solar panels and melt down the silver from them. Because there's such a chokehold in China, silver is rarely mined on its own. It's the byproduct of a couple other things when there's in smelters that are controlled disproportionately, sometimes 80, 90% by China. You know, China is not an expansivist bellicose nation, which is a good thing, you know, right now, outside of its own neighborhood.
Okay.
It's not yet seeking to...
Some would dispute that, but...
Yeah, I mean, okay, point taken, point taken. But in a different way than, let's say, some of the historical expansionists that led to World War I, World War II. That said, they have been unafraid to use their power to choke us, and we have been unafraid to use our power to choke back. I guess that's a good thing, because then again, it's a new type of mutually assured destruction. But if any of those powers becomes disproportionately powerful in one thing, they have a monopolistic way of being able to stop that. So the students were asking, you know, what's better, the choke point of the Strait of Hormuz or the choke point of you can't get any more solar and you're still 80% hydrocarbon economy today? And what are the conditions for getting those solar panels? If it's just a free market, great. Doesn't matter where they're made. That hasn't been what the last few years have been.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to take questions. Just raise your hand, wait for a microphone. I'll start right here in the front. Maybe just quickly identify yourself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Nicholas Alexi, teaching with UNITAR, United Nations.
Yep.
Firstly, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Lieutenant Garcetti. Thank you, Cal, for bringing amazing folks, inspiring hope really quickly. I really like what you built. I felt almost like I was in a Talking Heads concert. We went from burning down the house to once in a lifetime. Check out the lyrics.
How did I get here?
How did I get here? My God, what have we done? So,
I'll wear a bigger suit next time. There's a whole generation saying, what are you guys even talking about right now? Talking Heads, there was a really cool documentary out about it.
some of the folks here know AI can't replace that.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So what I'm seeing and understanding, architecture, building local, expanding international. I just received today from the city of LA for me to ask if I'm okay with a $174 bill to maintain the streetlights, or whether I'm opposed to that. I showed it to my wife, and she said, it's only $174. I showed it to my two sons, and they said, you could take us out to dinner with $174. How do we, at the same time, and I try
Or
to
just cook for them at home and pay for the lights.
at the same time, I try to teach my students, as you're doing hope and long-term sustainability, long-term games. We have insolvency local level. We have a dystopian neighborhoods. We have 40% of voters who are undecided for their local leadership. At the same time, we hear insolvency at international level, the United Nations, the lack of the Security Council maintaining and intervening, quote unquote. I know this is very hyperbolic and idealistic. Building hope is such a critical element of the pieces of the table and chair that you described to be built. How do we realistically maintain hope for people?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Zev probably has some opinions about this too. By the way, anything that's wrong now is probably my fault, and then I blame Zev because he started it. So, you know, you always blame who came before. But I think Zev and I were pretty good with the money. I left the biggest surplus we've ever had, and Zev was known as Dr. No when it came to budgets, both in the county and city. It's really tough for progressive people, but if you say no in the short term, you can say yes in the long term. That said, you know, hope, you know, there's this great Marge Piercy poem, Stone, Paper, Knife, that talks about hope, I'll paraphrase, hope waiting along frost line like a slumbering bear waiting to arise. And there's this kind of sense that hope is not something that a savior will deliver. When around election time, especially Democrats, the old cliche that Democrats want to fall in love and Republicans fall in line. Although now Republicans seem to like to fall in love, and maybe Democrats will fall in line. I don't know.
I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, but we do have this. We're getting lazier and lazier as citizens in the world, and especially here. Part of that is because you can click and get anything you want from anywhere in the world. That $178 you can get meals and things. You don't have to leave your house. I read that, we have a 14-year-old daughter, and I read that children today in America spend less time outside than inmates do on average. When the riots happened in 1992, there was all the conversations like, oh, blacks and Koreans just need to sit down and talk and get to know each other. And that happened, but there were such superficial conversations. It wasn't until we found common work to actually build together. I found as a council member, it wasn't until I got that Bangladeshi American and that Congolese immigrant and that Salvadorian that are living all complaining about not having a park or the tagging on their street to work on it together and not just assume that it would get done for them, that hope really starts to emerge, because hope comes from realizing your own power. Hope comes from realizing your own agency. That's why the pandemic was so tough. Every night as I talked to all of you, I would always give you something to do. I don't know if you noticed that, but somebody told me, communicate relentlessly, but make them actors in this play, not just observers. And we think democracy is about showing up at election time. And Ernst Renan, the French philosopher, said, the nation is a daily plebiscite. And it relies on two things. A shared story. We have to rewrite our story and make sure we share it, because if we don't, it crumbles. And then daily consent. And part of daily consent, it comes from daily action. And so to me, whether it's national service, whether it's, ways of finding common projects, we won't be able to build up the feeling of that hope unless we're actually working.
Okay, other questions? Right here.
Thank you, Honorable Ambassador. My name is Sam Bellamuri, and I'm from India.
Yes.
So,
From Bombay, you told me.
yes, yes.
I love it.
So my question is this. Whereas on one side, politically, India is aligned with Israel, and on the other side, its economic oxygen is Iran.
Right.
So how will that eventually play out? What do you think? And secondly, have you had any dialogue with any officials in India about the carbon footprint?
Yes, the second, a lot of conversations about carbon footprint. And India, is actually electrifying and adding renewables at a pace faster than China at the same point. Part of the problem, and it's a good problem, is that Indians are coming into the middle class as rapidly as Chinese did out of poverty, that in a hot country, people are buying things like air conditioners and cars, and so they're adding as much coal as they are adding renewables at the same time. But the country is now 50% capacity renewable energy, even if only about 20% of the actual electricity distributed is from renewable sources. So I've talked a lot about that. We have all sorts of technology initiatives between our two countries that I hope aren't being killed by this administration, about discovering the next ways of manufacturing, green technologies, transportation, et cetera. The promise of not of cold fusion, of small modular reactors, which was part of the deal that the US and India made, I think has to be probably a part of that. But yeah, a ton of that. I would dispute just a little bit. I think Iran they have decent relations with and have worked on some things, but they're not super close with Iran. They're friendly. But I don't think there's a lot of political oxygen.
The question suggested an economic tie, I think.
Yeah,
Well,
the economic piece, they're tied somewhat, but they're much more tied with the Arab countries in the Gulf than with Iran. So they have a lot at stake. When those countries aren't happy, when their diaspora can't work, when people who are high net worth suddenly are like, maybe I shouldn't be starting my company in Dubai, those two regions are really linked. And it's a complicated linking, because you're right. Israel and India have come together. Israel, I remember the Consul General of Israel telling me that after the United States and maybe Germany, that they thought India was its closest ally in the world. There's a lot of technology things that they've done together, a lot of water and agriculture and things. So there's that connection, but they also have very good connections with Arab countries at a time when Prime Minister Modi has been criticized for anti-Muslim rhetoric. That it's complicated, but somehow they make it work through really, supple diplomacy, I would say. But the longer this goes on, India, I think, will go back to that comfort zone of, okay, The whole world is a hostile place. You got to look out for yourself. Talk to others when you need to. Make transactions when you can, but don't get too close to anyone and let them come to you. And India increasingly can say that because with 1.4 billion people who are increasingly going to be wealthy, they will be in this century the world's largest economy. For sure. The math is indisputable. It will not, whether China will pass the US or not, I don't know, but India will pass both of us by the end of the century.
So at some point you will see India distancing itself sort of from Israel because of economic conditions.
No.
No.
I don't think that's the case. I guess what I was saying is they've been able to maintain that with Israel without any consequence from Arab or Muslim-led countries. They're managing to do both. And I think it's because they're just all tied together too much that the cost of doing that, nobody asks that of each other, at least at this point.
Right here. Thank you.
Since you,
Hey, Carol, how are you?
since you brought up COVID, I do want to just start out by saying thank you so much for what you did. I listened to your calls at the end of the day.
Sorry. We had nothing else to do, so.
And I can still remember, some of what you said. So really and truly, I'm sure that was a big challenge, but thank you. So I have a very sort of local question,
Yeah,
which
of course.
is, because you talked about thinking like architects and what comes next. And I'm on the board of an organization that co-founded one of the 9 hydrogen hubs around the
Right.
country called, the West Coast,
Yep.
California is called Arches, and so we were one of the co-founders of that. And so, no surprise, I mean, actually, we were getting some of the, we were supposed to get over $1 billion, we were getting
Yeah.
some of it, but no surprise. Recently, the president announced that the red state hubs are going to get funded, and the 2 West Coast hubs will, of course, Arches being one of them, will not be funded. So, in reference to what you said, my question is, thinking like, and I just had a board meeting this morning. We were talking about, trying to be creative, thinking forward, like creatively. What, when you think about something that's so important and innovative, public-private partnerships, other ways to fund something like that endeavor, Arches, what are some of the thoughts that come to your mind? Because, I know you've had to deal with this in so many different ways. Thank you.
Sure, of course. Welcome to my lecture on hydrogen. So we're gonna, I'll try to be really brief because I spent a lot of time with hydrogen and I don't want to get too far afield. But it's actually interesting. India, I think, is one of the places that may crack cheap hydrogen. They've got refining experience, which you actually need to have people who are chemically experienced. And they've got cheap enough labor, and they've got the need for diversifying fuels. It's still very expensive to make in the United States, and it's expensive to transport because it's the lightest element, and it's tough to transport in pipelines, and let alone on ships. But I think it's an important technology to continue pushing. Certainly as mayor, we looked at getting what was the largest coal plants that we had offline. In Utah, we own and completely get rid of the coal plants to put turbines that were going to run on natural gas, which was seen as pretty progressive at the time. But then we realized we could do a mix probably of natural gas and hydrogen, and maybe one day 100% hydrogen. Made green hydrogen from the excess solar power and wind power coming from the Midwest that comes up to that plant, but on days that can't use it, we lose that. But maybe it could actually be manufactured right there. And I don't think that you can give just to the red states and not give here, because none of this will work as an interconnected system if you don't have the largest port in America and the Western Hemisphere involved in that. So my ideas would really be talk to the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles. They're looking both at electric vehicles for the trucks, but also hydrogen. And I think those are the best places locally to find any resources in the meantime. And obviously there's the controversy about Scattergood, which is the power plant just to the south of LAX, and whether those old gas turbines should be turned into hydrogen, or some environmentalists are saying just make them into batteries and things like that. We don't need the hydrogen. I think it's good to still test the hydrogen there, and that's a good place to do it.
Okay, question in the back.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I believe it was Fisher and Urey in their work, Getting to Yes, who coined the acronym BATNA, Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. As we approach the deadline, Do you think there is a bad enough for the U.S. and for Iran? And if so, what is it?
I almost got through the whole day without like, well, how would you make peace in Iran? I mean, it's so, both sides are such unconventional negotiators. I had a good friend who comes from one of the countries that never negotiate with somebody who comes from a country starting with I, Iran, Israel, and India. They're the best negotiators in the world. Americans are terrible negotiators. We go to the store, it's like, okay, I want to buy this glass, it's $10, it says $10, here's $10, you leave the store. In India, it's like, don't worry about the sticker. It could be 10 rupees, it could be 1 rupee, it could be 100 rupees. Sit, let's have some tea. Tell me about your family. You know, if you don't get up and leave the store a couple times, you're not serious about negotiating. Indians will negotiate with their best friends, with their family. They'll yell at each other. It was my chief of staff in India's birthday, and we were in Goa, and I said, there's only one store that was open with like little trinkets. I said, get whatever you want. And she got a Eiffel Tower and a Statue of Liberty and some bangles, and it was $20. And I was about to pay, and my security detail was like, no, and started in Hindi, like arguing with the guy. And it went on for 15 minutes back and forth, and they're like, now you can pay. And I said, how much? And it was the equivalent of $17. I was like, $3 was not worth those 15 minutes. So I don't know, you know, I think the Iranians don't have much of an incentive to actually negotiate right now. I think they feel like they hold a lot of cards. And the American position is like, take this or leave it. And if you don't back that up with, we're going to bomb again, not that I'm suggesting we should, what's the incentive of actually coming together? The Iranians have found a new power. I don't see domestically that they feel insecure. I would really like to have the kind of briefings I did as ambassador to know on the ground. And I know some of you were talking about, you know, what's happening in Iran. I was talking with my friend Shireen. She's like, the Botox appointments are still happening. People are like living as if there's no war going on. And so if there's not a price to pay domestically, sure, some people have been killed in leadership, but you know, there's hundreds of thousands of people, if not low millions, that have prospered from the way Iran is economically set up, not just religiously and socially, and they're not going to give up power easily. So I don't think there's ever been an end game. This is the strategic absurdism that Brodie talked about. What was the goal? Was it, there's 5 or 6 different explanations. It was replace the leaders, it was we'll stop them from having missiles, it was nuclear weapons, it was we'll get the oil, we'll stop them from exporting terrorism. Like all those things are most of them noble, you know, in the abstract, but at what price? At what school getting bombed and civilians getting killed? Because there's, you know, the difference between us and previous generations is war is so antiseptic. Even to some extent in countries where it's happening, unless you're directly killed or in the neighborhood where the bomb is because it's so precise. And it's no longer just the size of your army, the size of your navy. Like, so they blew up the navy. We can brag about that, but so what? They're still able to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz because it doesn't take much anymore, as the Ukrainians, as I pointed to, also discovered. I was with President Biden in the Oval Office when Prime Minister Modi visited. Being President Biden, it was supposed to be a 5-minute meeting, but 45 minutes later, it was just, there were 6 of us in the Oval Office. It was one of the neatest experiences of my life. But President Biden, who really was the greatest president who's, I think, been a student of international relations his whole life, said, war is changing more in these 10 years than it's changed in the last 100, with the exception of nuclear weaponry. There's been no change anywhere close to what is happening now. So how do you negotiate peace when you don't know how war will be waged? How do you negotiate peace when you don't have a vision of what you want to see? Which is where I think Brodie has a lesson for all of us. It's not always about having the political outcome. Once you're in a war, he has this great chapter in there about World War I, where everybody thought it would be done like this. And each general on each side said, I'll just go a little bit stronger. And meanwhile, millions of young men died unnecessarily because there was really no strategic end to it. And if we don't have that idea, short of that, then what are we left with? And that's what Brodie writes about. Create the conditions of peace so that the cost of war is too much. And maybe that's the lesson here. No matter what side you are on in this war, what you think about its righteousness or not, the cost of war is too much for the world right now. And we have to figure out different ways to create conditions of peace, not to ignore human rights when they're being abused, not to leave people isolated, not to never use force. but at least to figure out a way that those conditions from the local community up, Indians told me a few times when I mildly spoke up about, one of our country's positions criticizing something happening in India. They're like, we agree with you, but that isn't your place to say. And it was a real lesson for me. They're like, only Indians can change India. And, Iranians will change Iran. There's never been as much offered for that possibility. And if it doesn't happen right here, right now, maybe this isn't the moment. And there's not enough bombing that can create it tomorrow. But what seems strategically absurd is that we don't have not only a plan for peace, I don't know that we had a plan for victory in the war.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador Eric Garcetti.